Susan Rowland, welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it with excitement and a little nervousness.
Yeah, nervousness is perfectly natural. One thing, real quick
Mm.
though, is maybe I should have asked you this before, but did I say your last name correctly? Is it Roland, or how do you pronounce it?
Roland, yes, Roland. I mean, you pronounced it perfectly for an American.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah. Okay. So you have a very interesting background. So
Mm.
you've done a lot of different things as far as the kind of the Jungian world, and uh,
Hmm.
and and you've taught at Pacifica Graduate. Do you still teach now?
I do still teach, yes. I'm coming to the end of my teaching career, but I do still teach.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and then you also you've written a lot of books. You've written both nonfiction and fiction, and then it seems
Mm.
like of late your focus has been on more of the fiction side, writing mystery novels.
That's right. Um, it- there is definitely a connection between the two. My last academic book was with the poet Joel Weishaus, and the book is called Jungian Arts-Based Research and the Nuclear Enchantment of New Mexico. Um, Jungian arts-based research isn't something I've invented, but I discovered arts-based research as a kind of new thing going on in the social sciences and beginning to go on in the humanities that I thought was very rich and very kind of Jungian inclining, and yet there was no Jung in it, or virtually no Jung in the resources available to students. And on the Jungian side, which I have been on for most of my career, there is a sort of block around art practice. Um, and so I thought, well, there's got to be a way of bringing these two sides together because the arts based research people need Jung, and the Jungians need arts based research as a way of going further into the psyche that is not clinical. Um, and so I put that book together, and then it was kind of natural to transition into my own arts based research, Jungian arts based research. So I see my mystery novels as research in the psyche, research in the culture, with a kind of Jungian framework that may or may not be visible to ordinary readers. That doesn't matter. What matters is it doing something real, and I think it is.
Well, take us back a couple of steps and help me understand
Mm.
what you mean by arts-based research. How would you define that, or how is it defined?
Yeah, well, it's it's been around for a while, and like good stuff anywhere, it didn't really start here. In many ways, it goes back to alchemy. But in the 1990s, various um, academics in the social sciences developed this thing called arts-based research. And if we think about research, if we think about academic research, research in universities, we kind of know what we're talking about. On the one hand, there is scientific research, there is the scientific method, and that places very strict conditions upon the researcher, that the researcher must be separate, wholly separate from the object of research. And that's a particularly powerful form of the subject object split, which is something that has become more and more hegemonic, more and more dominant in our culture, and continues to be extremely dominant today. So in the 19th century, various researchers realized that you couldn't do everything with the scientific method, there were things you just could not try to find out about systematically if you put them in a test tube or in a laboratory. So there was developed qualitative research, and qualitative research, uses the humanness and feelings and morality and relatability of the researcher to be part of that research. But there is still something missing. Usually in qualitative research, the imagination is very tightly controlled. And it's not usual to include the unconscious. It's not usual to include the world of dreams. The way the body is included is, again, kind of tightly controlled and regulated. And so it occurred that these thinkers in the 1990s realized that there was still parts of ways of experiencing the world that were not counted as research, and that art practice allows the unconscious, allows the imagination to be part of the research in a way that isn't allowed in other forms of research. And also, it kind of follows that arts-based research, doing research by doing art, is also connected to art itself. And art itself has histories and has kind of, I would say that it's the materialized psyche, but within all the different arts, there are histories, there are kind of social treasures, if you like, heritage, that again are not really brought into research from the inside out. People study art, people study architecture, people study music, people study literature, but what you can gain from actually doing it has not been typically valued as research. So arts-based research was the development of a methodology that included more of the psyche and isn't in fact limited to the single artist. You can do arts-based research in a group. You can do arts-based research with people that you want to help, that you want to support. So, instead of, I don't know, going to examine native Canadians on a remote island, you might go and ask the native Canadians to teach you their sand painting, and then you might create something together. And from that process, there would be knowledge gained that wouldn't be gained necessarily by sitting outside the group and observing them.
By experiencing it yourself, by participating in the creative acts, and then
Yes.
it is very
And
qualitative, huh? Because it would be even difficult to say exactly.
mm,
You kind of know what you're experiencing, but there's no guarantee that others would be experiencing the exact same thing.
and that doesn't have to be a problem, because what and I think the Jungian perspective actually really helps here, because what you have with arts-based research is you have a work of art. And a work of art, by its nature, is communicative. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to communicate the same thing to all people. It definitely won't. But the art can go into the world and can communicate with audiences in the same world as the artist. It can also communicate to audiences that are in a different world from the artist, a different culture, a different time. So arts-based research produces art as an engine of meaning making. as something that has an independent existence apart from the artist. Now, the Jung is really helpful here because in Jungian psychology, the image, the psychic image, is clearly part of the imagination, but it has an autonomy and independence. And the artwork is a materialization of the psychic image so that it can leave the person who originally had the image and go and be a psychic, a repository of psychic energy and meaning making for other people. This is why I think Jungian arts-based research is therapy with the world, in a very deep sense, because it's addressing the collective culture through working with an already existing genre, or it could be a form of art that doesn't exist yet, but will still be measured from the point of view of the existing genres. And it can contribute more of the collective psyche into the world by means of that independent, autonomous artwork that is full of independent, autonomous psychic images. What artists find that is particularly good for the world of research is they find stuff that is unexpected. You know, you write a poem, things happen that you didn't necessarily predict or expect or even want. There is a kind of a temenos, a home for spontaneity. And traditional research doesn't really like or want spontaneity. But it's part of who we are, it's part of the way the psyche works. And of course, people being unexpected is part of the way the world works. So there's a sense in which Jungian arts-based research is a way to bring psychic wholeness into research and to promote the creative psyche for the audience as well as for the artist researcher. Basically, doing a Jungian arts-based research project, as I've done with many students and I'm doing myself, stuff happens that you didn't plan for, and it's very often very valuable, because just as dreams will produce material that you didn't want or expect, so will create any form of art practice.
Yeah, this is something that I actually think about a lot, and I was thinking about it in kind of a new way just recently, where yeah, obviously as an artist, as a creator, you want to be surprised. You're gonna sit
Mm-hmm.
down, whether it's a painting or you know, a
Mm.
book, a piece, something that you're writing.
Mm.
You're gonna sit down with to do the work with a kind of a broad, large scale kind of overview
Mm.
idea of what it's going to
Mm.
be. But especially in writing, as you start going, you're writing, and then things will just come out that
Mm-hmm.
surprise you. In that
Mm.
you can't picture, especially if it's, say it's a
Mm.
300-page novel, you can't picture
Mm.
every detail before you actually
Mm.
sit down and let it come out. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be things that surprise you, and
Mm.
the this may be a little off the wall, but I think it actually is pertinent. Like, I was thinking about it this way recently, where if creativity is this coming together of both the feminine and the masculine, it requires both sides.
Mm.
Even when we're producing art, of course it's got to surprise you, because that's
Mm.
creativity. Like the way you were saying, this is how we experience the real
Mm.
world. When say a man and a woman get together and they decide to have a baby, or they, you know, they create a baby,
Mm.
everybody knows that a baby is going to come out, and then that's kind
Mm.
of that like broader view
Mm.
image of what it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
But especially without modern technology, nobody knows whether that baby is going to come out a boy or a girl, and nobody knows
Mm-hmm.
until it's born. Nobody knows what its
Mm.
particular characteristics are going to be, what its
Mm.
interests and likes and dislikes are going to
Mm.
be. And so in the real world, in the creative act of the real world,
Mm.
there's always a bit of mystery until the thing actually reveals itself. And I think that
Mm.
in the creative process, it should be the same, especially
Mm.
if you're writing too much from like an egocentric perspective. You're not
Mm.
going to surprise yourself. You're going to almost
Mm.
ensure that you don't surprise yourself,
Mm.
because the ego
Mm.
hates to be surprised.
Mm.
But if you sit down and you allow the unconscious to come up, or to whatever to
Mm.
bubble up from the unconscious,
Mm.
then creativity itself should be surprising.
Mm. And don't you think the mystery never ends, because it's usually a boy or a girl. There are exceptions, but the child surprises the parents all the time.
Yeah.
Parents don't end up with what they wanted, even. There is another being there, that being is going to struggle against parents' wishes and expectations. So it's about dealing with forms of life that are really never going to give up all their mystery and their capacity to surprise and to provoke spontaneous reactions.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the same way, if a parent tries to, if they try too much to be
Mm.
egocentric in their parenting or in their child rearing,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to, I guess you could say, cause problems with the finished piece, right?
Yes.
You're going to cause
Yeah.
complexes and hidden shame
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all these different things. So, in the same way, yeah, in life, I think that's honestly, I'm a parent, so I have two kids.
Mm.
Just reaching kind of the adolescent
Mm.
middle ages, and
Mm.
the more I spend time with them as a father over the years, the
Mm.
more I have to learn to relax into that kind of, into almost like a passive state of just watching and
Mm.
just being
Yeah.
excited about whatever
Yeah.
comes out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's a complicated passive state, isn't it? Because you are always going to be the parent, and you're always going to feel in some way responsible, and that you're kind of looking out for them, and that you're putting caring in there, but you can't control them. um, just as we can't control our own psyches, but we have to be responsible for what they do.
Yeah, I guess as a writer, maybe you could relate to this, where in your writing, it's actually helpful to set certain parameters around
Mm.
timeline or characters or topics that you're willing to
Mm.
cover, because if not, you could just go off on tangents that in the end you're going to have to,
Mm.
they kind of divert from the actual piece. And in the same
Mm.
way with children, yeah, maybe it is your role to set some
Mm.
certain parameters, but
Mm.
within those parameters to give them a lot of freedom to
Yeah.
experience it for themselves.
Yeah. I think when it comes to writing, there is the question of why bother? Why do it at all? And why keep going? Because, it's not like most writers find instant fame and fortune. So it's tough to keep going. Why are you doing it? And I came into fiction writing as a development out of my academic interests, one of which has always been gender in Jungian psychology. And so for many years, I was thinking of uh, trying to write a different kind of detective story where the detective would be essentially three people, not a great person and a sidekick, and that these three people would represent marginalized women. And so when I came across the idea of the triple goddess, which itself has sort of interesting contested origins, But the idea of a crone, a mother, and a maiden, they represent um, stages of life, if you like, where women suffer and can be marginalized, and also need to be thought of symbolically. So my main character is a crone who is in her 60s and has made a serious mistake in her early life, which meant that she didn't have a family. Um, and my mother figure is not someone who has given birth because she has chronic clinical depression, but she is motherly in many ways. And my maiden figure is a young woman who is not a maiden because she's not had sex, but because she's never experienced love. She was trafficked as a child. And I've thought for many years that the trafficked woman is in many ways a kind of icon of our time. And maybe the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing is one way of seeing that. And I don't know a great deal about the trafficking of women for sex, but this is about the imagination. And I wanted to look at women who had been marginalized. And crucially, I'm interested in failure, or rather, I'm interested in real life where we have things in our lives that you can't magic away. You can't win. I really hate the hero's journey. If you want to hear me ranting, just mention that term. You cannot win. You cannot win if you have been bereaved and you've lost someone. You cannot win if you acquire a disability. A very wise person said, "The unconscious is that which defeats you." And particularly in America, I think we're taught to be ashamed of defeat and we should never accept defeat, and we're going to win out in the end and win the prize. Well, that's not what life is like. We are defeated. The question is, what then? What do you do with the defeat? And what's one of the things that's really great about Jungian psychology is that your defeat can become your superpower. It is the dark side of the psyche, and in darkness there is great strength and fertility. So my books are meant to show these women coming to terms with their defeat and using their own suffering to help other people and to make a new family. And I feel very strongly about that. For Anna, my trafficked girl, it's very much about just imagination. What would someone who'd never had a real childhood be like? And how could she live a good life? And with Caroline, my mother with chronic clinical depression, I have chronic clinical depression. It's never going to go away. So, what do you do with that? I want to show that something positive can be done with that. And with my crone figure, she's not someone who gives up, even though she can never get back what she's lost. And she's lost the chance to have a life with the child she bore. And she comes across him and loses him the sort of instant she comes across him. So she loses him twice, the second time when she's 60. And that then becomes what makes her go out into the world and try to help other people.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very beauty from ashes. It's very alchemical in the sense of turning the the crap or the shit from your life into the gold of your life,
Yes,
right?
that's right. That's right.
Well, you were talking about your characters, and
Yeah,
you've got the crone and the mother and the maiden, and
yeah.
this idea of well, I guess that's what I was about to say. Is it's interesting
Mm,
that you come at it from this perspective of winning, or another way of thinking about it is just getting out of life what you expected or what you're told you're supposed to
mm,
get out of life, and then
mm,
this response to it of at some point realizing that what you've been
mm,
told you're supposed to get out of life is kind of just a myth. It's just a story that you've been
mm,
given,
mm,
and that at some level you have to acknowledge that you're never going to be able to have the past that you wished you would have had.
mm,
For
mm,
me, it was, I grew up in a very religious home that it took a
mm,
long time for me to figure out. And then
mm,
even after that, I had to go through
mm,
figuring out a lot of familial
mm,
trauma and that environment.
mm,
And so, yeah, a big part of like looking back on all of that is
mm,
realizing that those things that you wanted, those things you feel like you probably
mm,
needed, you're never going to actually be able to go back and get them. And so it's a
mm,
point of starting right there, and then from that point
mm,
forward, just doing the best you can with what you do have, and how,
mm,
pointing yourself in a direction of
mm,
whatever it is you hope to end up with now, which may be
mm,
very different
mm,
than what you hope to end up with before.
mm, mm. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I too had have a had a struggle with a religious background. My mother brought us up in the Church of England, which was fine. I was fine with that. Then she became a fundamentalist, and you had to see things her way, or you were going to go to hell. And I have a brother and sister, and they kind of managed to work with this in a way that I couldn't. And so I had a lot of "you are going to hell," and that was very, very difficult.
Did you,
And in
when
fact,
you say that, did you mean, do you mean that you received that from your mother, from your family, or was that kind of an internal voice you were hearing as well?
no, that was my mother telling me. She felt that she would go to hell if she didn't get the whole family into this particular religious mindset. And I think my brother and sister managed to kind of go under the radar with this, which was probably the right thing to do. But I just couldn't do it. And it was, in fact, that was really how I got into Jungian psychology, because I was at university. I was struggling with what would later become a diagnosis of clinical depression. And a friend of mine gave me Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and it just made a lot of sense. And I realized for the first time that there was, that I could sort of accept a kind of religious yearning without having to be this particular fundamentalist um, set of ideas and precepts.
Yeah, how old were you when this occurred, and then going forward, what was your relationship to just religion in general, kind of your position with religion?
Yes. Well, my so I was 19 when I first read Jung, and I kind of stayed with the Jungian take on religion, which is usefully complex, and includes, there is a religious instinct, but you don't have to do much with it, to full on kind of spiritual acceptance of a particular religion, particularly varieties of Christianity. Um, I've always been interested in the history of Christianity and all the different varieties, and that was kind of useful when I moved to the United States because there are the history of Christianity and the history of the United States is very kind of tightly bound up. But I haven't really been a churchgoer in my life. I've sort of kind of hung around the margins. My feeling around religion is much more nature based. And I'm very drawn to things like Wicca. And in fact, in my stories, I have a group of witches who worship an earth goddess and are linked to the history of alchemy and are linked to the history of Christianity. I mean, Christianity is fascinating in that you have the Pope, you have the very different Orthodox churches, you have these kind of whole array of Protestant churches that some of them are very fundamentalist and seem to be more concerned with people's sex lives than their actual faith lives. That's always been something I've felt strongly about, that prejudice against gay people is just wrong. And I say to people frequently, the best thing that's happened in my life is marriage equality. And just seeing people so happy, it's astonishing to me that people could not want other people to be happy like that. So that does come into religion, and it certainly came into my mother's religion. She wasn't someone who was naturally prejudiced, but she kind of adopted those kinds of rejections. So I think religion is a big part of my life, in the sense that it is there in the writing, partly in a kind of attraction to a very egalitarian, nature-based sense of the divine, but also the genuine Jungian sense that religion is part of the imagination, I suppose.
Yeah.
And that it's going to be part of the imagination, and there are different ways that could be imaged.
Yeah, for sure.
So
yeah, certainly. It's definitely it's in a sense it's inescapable as humans. Religion to me, in a sense, where it is, like you were saying, it is imagination, and it's the way that the human operating system works. It's the way that we interface with the world. It's just that religion, so religion is like the codification of imagination, in a sense, where then it's enforced on people, as if I had a conversation with somebody recently where they said it really well, that religion is this expectation that we all have the same spiritual experience that somebody had at one point in one place, right? So take the Christian myth of Jesus. I think that the Christian myth is, I mean, it's absolutely critical for our time and our place, but to expect everybody to interpret it the same way, believe in it the same way, operate in the same way. When we started this conversation and you were talking about art and how art is putting forth this material representation of the psyche's experience. And that's what the Jesus myth is. But just like you said at the beginning of our conversation, not everybody will have the same response to that image. And so the real challenge with religion is that it has this there's like this expectation that we all experience it the
mm,
same way. It needs to become
mm,
very
mm,
objective, but kind of
mm,
the whole what we've been discussing with art-based
mm,
research, and
mm,
we bringing that object and subject
mm,
together, it's such that nobody on the planet can possibly have the exact same objective experience. It's just not how the psyche,
mm,
and it's not how the psyche works, and it's not how
mm,
reality actually functions,
mhm,
because we are
mhm,
all just a
mm,
conglomerate of
mm,
our senses and our
mm,
experiences and our genetics and our environment, and so
mm,
nobody is
mm.
having the exact same objective experience.
Yeah,
And that's not the
yeah.
point. That's not the point to have that.
Yes. I mean, to me, the problem with religion is it getting entangled with power, which it has always done. And it may be that at some level there has to be some entanglement with power, if only to allow people's subjective experiences to be, tolerated by other people. But certainly the way religion and we can take Christianity as a very big example, you know, kind of informed the way power was organized and continues to do so. That does get to be very dangerous. The other thing, and this goes back to what you were saying about religion is how we kind of relate to reality. Science, the science we know and love, comes from Christianity. It's not anti-religious. It's a development out of a religious idea of God being separate from the world he created. Therefore, uh, you know um, to understand the world you have to be separate from it. And that's a kind of just a very condensed version of what happened. But Philip Pullman's books are very historically accurate in the sense that the first scientists were theologians and they were looking at the world to justify the book of the Bible. And eventually they were just looking at the world, but they were looking at it assuming that they could abstract knowledge from it because God was separate from the planet. So therefore, divine knowledge or scientific knowledge can be separated from its material manifestation.
Yeah, I think
And
it's
that's
oh yeah, go
probably
ahead.
not true.
It's very interesting to me, this, and I've talked to a handful of people about this on this podcast, but this idea that science and religion should be almost competitive, or
Mm,
they're mutually exclusive
mm,
ideas, it just doesn't make
mm-hmm,
sense. The way I see it is that the underlying desire to understand is actually the same with science and religion. They're
mm-hmm,
both
mm-hmm,
methodologies for explaining the world around us.
mm-hmm,
one of them
mm-hmm,
one of them relies on this objective, imperialistic, data driven kind of objectivity,
mm,
and the other one, it relies on symbol and story and
mm,
motif and
mm,
imagination, and what Jung would have called archetypes and
mm,
archetypal forces. And
mm,
the interesting thing to me about it is that they're both a desire to conceptualize the world and understand it. Science
mm,
seems to be able to answer the questions
mm,
of how, and religion, on the other hand, it tries to answer the questions of why. And so they're asking different questions,
mm,
but they're asking it for the same underlying
mm.
desire to know.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right, except there are limits on science, that kind of science. And those limits were discovered with quantum science. The problem with objective science is that the world is not a stable series of objects. The world is like people. It moves around and interacts, and there is a kind of a spontaneity and an unpredictability that is in the system. And so things like complexity theory are much more satisfactory ways of understanding how some crucial things happen. And that would include but we would be inside the complex systems, not outside, pretending that we're not inside.
Do you feel like there's something about this arrival in the scientific world where we understand that there's certain things we can't understand,
Mm-hmm.
and then also kind of this rise or this ascension of Jungian thought in the recent, maybe the
Mm,
past decade or two?
mm,
Um, do you see some kind of correlation there where people are realizing that just existence itself or
mm,
being a human, it has
mm,
these two sides of
mm.
the same coin?
Yeah, I do think there's a correlation. I mean, I think the unconscious has become more noticeable at all levels, but noticeable in science with, well, noticeable in physics with the quantum level. But in many sciences, I think there is a recognition of a kind of deeper underlying complexity to things. So things like biology, people talking about how plants are actually very interdependent and can also act in ways that look a bit like consciousness when it comes to interacting with each other. And that's not the kind of consciousness that we mean by the ego. So there is a kind of unconscious at work. Um, One of the things that I think is particularly important, and many of my colleagues have pointed this out, that in trying to understand some very ancient systems, they're beginning to kind of converge in terms of, you know, what Jungians have been talking about with archetypes and the collective unconscious seem to be not unlike various indigenous spiritualities. Um, but some of the ideas of this sort of unconscious connectivity have been around for thousands of years, like alchemy and astrology and magic, for example. Um, so there is a sense that different cultures um, are doing very similar things, not the same things, but very similar things at this sort of unconscious level.
To me, it
That I
seems,
think is hopeful.
yeah, I think it is helpful. I think you're right. I think there is this, I don't know if it's like this modern phenomenon or if it's just a
Mm,
cycle that societies go through over
mm,
and over, where there
mm-hmm,
does seem to be some group of people who are going, oh wait,
mm,
reality isn't
mm.
just what we experience. It's like there's something deeper going on.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's, maybe a few years ago I would have thought that humanity as a whole was evolving into something else,
Mm,
some other
mm-hmm,
awareness. But at this point, I'm not sure if we're not just in a cycle that we go
mm,
through over and over as,
mm,
because if you just look back at the various groups
mm,
of people back in time,
mm,
um, going, the Europeans
mm,
and going back to the Romans, going back
mm,
to the Greeks and the Egyptians,
mm,
there seems to be these collective myths that everybody
mm,
adopts. We call them religions, or maybe they're state systems.
mm,
And as long as everybody really buys into them, they work to hold
mm,
everybody together. And there's like this successful
mm,
period. And then gradually, some group of people start to look around
mm,
and go, the Greeks did this, the Indians have done this, where
mm,
they look around and they
mm,
go, oh, these gods are not
mm,
literal concrete things outside of us. These are just,
mm,
like you were saying, material representations. We create them
mm,
materially so that we can understand. It's
mm,
like a reflection of how we're oriented on the
mm,
inside. And eventually enough people start to see that those things are not internal, or they're not external, but they're just a reflection of the internal. And over time,
mm,
because of that, the myths start to lose hold. And then
mm,
that's the gradual,
mm,
dissembly of the collective under that myth. And then it just kind of
mm,
starts over. And it seems to me like we may be experiencing that in some way. I think Nietzsche called it out in Europe a long time ago, like
mm,
130 years ago, when he
mm,
said God is dead. I think that's what he was talking about. In America, we
mm,
seem to be holding on a little bit with more firmness, but it
mm,
does seem that that collective, whatever that collective
mm,
thing is that has held us together for a long time, there are
mm,
enough people who aren't seeing it anymore that it's starting. You're
mm,
starting to see kind of you're feeling
mm,
that the
mm,
beginning of something shifting.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where C.G. Jung was coming from. And in fact, he wrote a book about that very point called Aeon, which is he goes through the myths that that held and then failed, and then a new one arises. And at the end of the book, of course, he says, well, the new one is Jungian psychology. But then, and then he goes on to say, but then there will be something else. Um, and I think that's a very plausible way of seeing it. I want to hang on to the notion that interiority is itself a myth, and that because if it does seem to me to be a dimension of the atomization of the individual, so that the unit of human existence is the individual, and then we have to kind of build out from that. That's a very modern notion, and it doesn't seem to be working very well at the moment. So
In a sense, we've become so individualized that we're all worshiping our own internal gods.
yeah, yeah, and I'd like to think that's not, a necessary way of thinking of human life. I mean, we clearly come from the planet in some way. So, do we come from the planet and the planet's just sort of waved goodbye to us, or are we in some sense connected to a bigger ecosystem in a real way, not just an imaginary one? And anyway, who says imagination is imaginary? It may be absolutely vital to the existence of human beings, and it may be what connects us to existences beyond human.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, this kind of goes back to when you were talking about your kind of relationship with religion and the things that you, I guess,
Mm,
connect with the most. And
mm,
the Western world for a long time, at least in the axial age, we've been under this monotheistic myth, which is the worship
mm,
of an individual male god.
mm,
And it's
mm,
obvious that it's separated us in the same way that you were talking about that God being separated from its creation and
mm,
becoming these distinct things. In a
mm,
sense, the worship of that mythic motif for so
mm,
long has created the same experience for us,
mm,
where we are separate from the planet that we
mm,
are, the very particles that we're made up of have come
mm,
from this planet, and
mm,
yet we kind of see ourselves
mm.
as separate from it. And
Yes.
it is interesting. I like the way that you point out that that's
Mm.
the thing with Jungian psychology, is every time you think you've gotten to something, you can just go, oh wait, that's a
Yeah.
myth too. That's a myth too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's how our psyches
Mm,
relate to the world, is we tell stories, and then
mm,
we see
mm,
if we fit in those stories. And so it creates that mystery that will always be a mystery.
mm,
There is no bottom to that, that dark, whatever abyss that is the
mm,
collective unconscious.
mm, mm.
I am curious
Yeah,
about.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, something that kind of sums up a lot of what I've said so far is my experience of writing a novel and deciding, you know, I use the mystery genre because it's actually chock full of myths, And the type of mysteries I like are very, very much a recapitulation of the Holy Grail story. And obviously the Grail Knight is the detective, and the solution to the murder is the Grail itself, and you have to find the right questions, and you get the solution. The solution heals the wasteland. I believe in happy endings, so I like the positive mystery where there's a kind of healing of a community. Anyway, so I was writing this story, and typically you have a dislikable victim so that your reader isn't too upset by the murder. So I invent this dislikable American teenager who gets knocked off, and I have my Mary Wandwalker crone sort of worrying about this because she's supposed to be nice and people are supposed to like her. And so she was thinking about the murder, Mary Wandwalker, and suddenly a voice comes in and says, "I'm still here." So a voice came into my head, and it was my murder victim saying, "I'm not having this. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not finished. I'm still in this story." And if you're doing Jungian arts-based research, then you have to give the spontaneity of the psyche a chance to do its thing. So I knew I had to let this happen. And it becomes an important part of the story that Mary, my main character, hears the voice of the dead girl. And they develop a relationship in the story that they didn't have in life. In life, Mary kind of dismissed this spoilt girl, but in death, she has to she can't get away. The dead girl is just there talking to her and saying, "I'm not finished with you, Mary Wandwalker," and that is a sort of the most extreme example of what happens when you write, that things happen that you didn't plan for, you didn't want, you didn't expect. And I think that's kind of at the heart of where I am with the psyche and religion, to allow for the unexpected twist and turn, and to try to work positively with that. Not that it's always possible, but that's kind of how I feel about allowing the mystery to be part of the story, and not needing I need to kind of be certain about things. What was most frightening about my mother's religion was the certainty. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I have the same experience. I grew up in a very
Mm.
I grew up LDS or Mormon, and so my mother had
Mm.
like an extreme certainty about it, and
Mm.
to this day she carries that forward, and it makes it difficult. So I also I do this podcast, but I also my main thing is writing. I'd like to be a writer, and I've
Mm.
actually been working on literary fiction novels. And so
Mm.
I one thing I want to ask you about all of this, thinking about
Mm.
this, your Jungian understanding, and then also this idea
Mm.
of arts-based research, and then
Mm.
writing novels yourself. For
Mm.
you as a person, how do you experience or how do you see yourself relating to these characters as they come out of
Mm.
you, and then
Mm.
do you feel that reflection of yourself? Is it almost like
Mm.
working with dreams, in a sense that it comes out and then you can sit there and
Mm.
you can sit with it
Mm.
as though it's a reflection of yourself?
Well, I try not to think about it as a reflection of myself. Um, I know a lot of people who have written memoirs and autobiographies, and I absolutely never will do that. I don't have enough of myself. I want to do in fiction something else. I want to go for the unknown psyche and let the unknown psyche work with me. So I'm not thinking about characters as part of myself. Yes, inevitably, there are many characteristics in the characters that come from me in some way, but I try to very much downplay that. And I would never base a character on a real person. I think that's just wrong. However, I do, there are parts of my life where that have stayed with me, like a dream will stay with you. And in that sense, I'm thinking, okay, there's something there that wants to be dealt with, and maybe I should put it in a story. And I have done that. And so there are, you know, there is a sort of deep autobiography in the stories, but it's not something that anybody would recognize, I think. Just as a small example, when I was at university in England, it was the 1980s. It was before the Berlin Wall came down. There was a big anti-nuclear movement, and I went on some demonstrations, some of which were at a famous women's peace camp called Greenham Common. And it was a very powerful experience going on those demonstrations, very powerful. And it stayed with me. And so I've decided I want to put it into a story, that I want to try and just give a taste of that, because it was a very kind of strong sense of 1,000 people moving together and working as one in ways that were obviously to do with consciousness, but also a kind of unconsciousness. There was a real sense of unity on some of those occasions, which you don't often get. And that struck me as somehow very important.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I would be interested to see it once you've been able to put it down in writing. Um,
Mm,
Susan, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. This has been a lot of fun.
mm.
If somebody is interested in your work, your books, your blog, anything that you're up to, where would they go to find you online?
Well, I'm certainly on social media. My books are available from any good online bookstore. The Mary Wandwalker Mysteries I recommend. The most recent one is the Swan Lake Murders, which does an awful lot with Swan Lake, a folk tale, but also it has a sort of sunken narrative that's related to Shakespeare's The Tempest. So the Mary Wandwalker novels are about, and also um, my scholarly writing is available. I do have a website which I don't know how to maintain, so it's a little bit out of date. But I can be found on social media, and also on which has my email addresses, so people can contact me if they'd like to.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I really enjoyed it and I felt like I learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.